right. Well, welcome everybody to our the second episode with Jeremy. Now we've had the first one, which had some extraneous background noises, which uh, fortunately I had a very busy house that day, and there was a lot of work going on in the background, and so we could pick that up, and we apologize for that. But it was a great first conversation, Jeremy, and you're worthy. Adversary, if I should say, not adversary necessarily, but a worthy partner here in our conversations, and I thought that went really well. I'm really excited about finishing off book one today with you, and I think the 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 way we decided this one would be that Jeremy, you had taken down a few notes and made some observations yourself on book one, and so I would like you to kind of start off the conversation, and I'll just fill in the gaps as we go along. So whenever you're ready.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. So I thought we could start, last time we talked more high level about a lot of the concepts, I think, within book one, but to frame book one, I thought we could start with, what Aristotle is really beginning with, in my understanding and interpretation here, is that he's really asking, what is the ultimate purpose of life? Um, he's observing everything that we do, from working to going to school to spending time with our families. Um, it all is aimed at something, right? And so what is that? What is that something? And he thinks that there must be like a higher, like our what's our highest goal in terms of what are we seeking, and is that good? Is that what we are seeking? And so my interpretation is that he's saying that the highest goal is happiness. So if our ultimate purpose in life, according to Aristotle, is happiness,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think from there we get into defining it. But how do you think of that, and how did you interpret kind of his bigger picture thinking?
Yeah, I see. He starts off with like a almost not I should say not a very practical way of getting around the question of why we do everything, because saying that we do everything for happiness, before you get there you have to kind of lay some ground rules down as to what we mean by that. And this is not a this is not really a dialogue between us and Aristotle. This is Aristotle's thoughts on it.
Right. Right.
And so it's hard to critique any of this. Like, one of the things to do is you have to just accept the author's views, and then in your mind decide whether you agree with it or not agree with it. The thing about it is that this is Aristotle. Like, that man is genius. I don't know what his IQ was, but it was obviously the smartest, most intelligent man on the planet ever. And so it's very hard to then argue with Aristotle. He says this, and arguing back with him would have not been a very good thing to do back in the day, because he raised down some ground rules. He says, if you're somebody who's not willing to learn, then you shouldn't be participating in this conversation. And
Mm-hmm.
he set some ground rules. He knows, and then the person who's willing to participate in this conversation is somebody who knows they don't know and are willing to learn from somebody who knows. And so I think, but having said that, I try to argue with this, saying, is it in fact happiness that we are all seeking? And I played that game of the wise with everything one does, no matter um, how narrow uh, the expression of the action is in one's life. If one asks why one did it, even if that action for a momentary period led to discomfort, you would still say there was something that you wanted to get out of that. And whatever you wanted to get out of that is a good in one's mind. And that's why one does these things. And obviously, all of this is predicated upon the fact that we are rational beings. That means we can differentiate between good and bad, and that we are acting on our own volition, because one can be forced to do things, either good or bad things, and those are not necessarily goods that one is trying to do. And so this is if acting if out of free will, rational thought, and then going ahead and performing an activity. Most likely, what you're trying to achieve, that goal is a good, and it's a small g good, and then the way you achieved it is an activity, and that activity itself is subservient to what you were trying to achieve. But if you do one thing to get to the other thing, that in that other thing, even if it's an activity, even that activity can be a good. So goods can be activities, good can be things that come out of activities, but activities leads to goals, goals lead to bigger goals, and then there's a hierarchical nature of good. And the capital G good is a he argues against Plato. Plato says that there is a good that one does for no other reason but only for itself. That good doesn't lead to any other good. It's only done for itself. Aristotle argues against that good, not so much for any other reason, but saying that good is kind of an impractical good. What good is that to a physician, in practicing medicine? Because having an idea of what the good is doesn't necessarily help you participate in your day-to-day life. But I feel that there's an importance to have an eye toward that good, and even he says that like you should aim toward that good, and that good from a practical perspective, not from the universe's perspective, but from a rational being's perspective, that good, the thing that you do, capital G good, that you do only for itself, for no other reason but for itself, is happiness. So that is why Aristotle believes that happiness is the be all or end all of the good that we are trying to seek. But if you want to critique it, Plato would say that that is all well and good inside the narrow framework of a rational being, a temporary being. From a universal scale,
Mm-hmm.
happiness at an individual level is of no bearing.
Is what?
Is of no bearing. It
Of
really
no bearing.
makes no sense. Yeah, I mean, the universe existed for millennia before humans ever existed, and it's going to continue to exist for millennia. And so, if the good that you and me are seeking, we call it capital G good, and it is happiness or flourishing or whatever. It is just a a figment, a fragment of time, like mere like drops in an endless ocean of time. And so that is, I think, a little bit of a dichotomy between Plato and Aristotle. But for our purposes, for from a day-to-day perspective, I agree with you. And similarly, I agree with Aristotle, which I'm in no position to disagree with him. that that happiness turns out to be that thing that I cannot tell. If I keep asking myself why do I want to do something, and if finally I reach, because I want to be happy. If I ask myself why do I want to be happy, I really don't get a good answer. I do it because I want to be happy. And so it
Right.
becomes an end in and of itself.
Well, I think it's both ends, right? I mean, I think that um, they're both right. There is this larger good, larger happiness
Uh-huh.
with an end, and that maybe you can never truly measure or track. And then there's these, day to day, moment to moment that over time also build into a moment of happiness now or doing good now, right? And you do that over the course of your lifetime. It that then creates like a bigger sense um, of what happiness is, or maybe what leading a good life is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have to try to limit Aristotle's discussions to a very practical lens
Right.
and try not to get metaphysical with it.
Mhm.
And so, from a practical perspective, I don't find any disagreement in what he has to say.
Right. And now, if we're defining how how Aristotle is defining like true happiness, is that so? It's living a life of moral and intellectual excellence. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think what he says is this division of goods is also comes from divisions of different types of lives, right? And we discussed a little bit of this in our prior episode, where there is stages of evolution of a human being, and one can be caught in a very juvenile state of being,
Mm-hmm.
where one believes that happiness is the fulfillment of desire, of pleasures, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So the pleasure seeking soul is a soul that is in pursuit of pleasure. And when pleasure is fulfilled, it seeks more pleasure, and it believes that happiness is the accumulation of these small age happinesses, each with fulfillment of a bit of pleasure. But the happiness that one can get by living a life enslaved to pleasure seeking, what I call like the rock star life, right?
Sure.
Is the happiness pales in comparison to the honor seeking life. And that is, I find most people that I have come in contact with, including myself, I would say we are in that honor seeking stage. But we had discussed this, that in that, just it's not that pleasure seeking is something that you completely give up in honor, in seeking honor. You seek pleasure and seek honor.
Mm-hmm.
And so you bring that pleasure seeking part with you as you transition into this honor seeking role. And the thing with honor is honor, and an accumulation of wealth is a form of honor seeking. One doesn't want to acquire money just for money's sake. Money buys things, buys power, influence, status. And so honor seeking is also money. But even within that realm, there is seeking wealth and seeking honor through acts and deeds that one would believe gets someone a higher merit in society. Usually these are in service of the multitude, either generous acts or political acts and so on and so forth. But honor in that sense, one is not trying to seek honor from dishonorable people. You're seeking it from honorable people. And when we believe someone is honorable, we are actually believing that they have virtue. It is virtue that one is trying to, because they have that virtue, they're honorable, and one is hoping to get honor from those folks, so that gives you a sense of, um what is that word, it makes you believe that you are actually worth something because you got honor from somebody who was honorable. And so, but what one is seeking, if one actually looks deep down in honor seeking life, is in fact virtue. So one is trying to build the virtues and be applauded for the fact that one has virtue. But then there is a next step in this process, and I think when one gets into that step, one could step away from the pleasure seeking and the honor seeking life and step into this contemplative life.
Mm-hmm.
And now one could be in the early stages of that contemplative life and still carry the pleasure seeking and the honor seeking with them. But there are those who completely transition into this threshold of a contemplative life where they let go of pleasures and honor, and now they are in the pursuit of wisdom, which is the highest level of pleasure that one can get for their soul. A sort of pleasure for the soul is the highest level of happiness that one can get. One gets from a contemplative life. So there is this small goods that one has to acquire through life.
Mm-hmm.
Then they transform into bigger goods, and then those goods can transform into a capital G good. But the further along you are in the spectrum towards a contemplative life, the higher the rewards there are. And so that's what believe his thought process is in this.
Yeah, and I agree. I think the how we define pleasure over our lifetime changes,
Hmm.
right? From the rock star life in your early 20s, where you also might be thrill seeking and what that looks like versus, you know, the ability to be more contemplative over time and how pleasure comes in different ways and doing good comes in different ways is that evolution in a shift in how one looks at um, potentially what is virtuous, right? Like virtue, I was looking at as like a muscle that needs to be, practiced. It
Yeah,
needs to be exercised,
absolutely.
and that changes and evolves over time too. Of what is practicing um, good habits in over time will continue to, as you're saying, it builds on each other. Yeah, I agree with that.
Ah, awesome.
Yeah. All right. So if we define, let's say, so we're defining virtue as doing the right thing.
Yeah. So yeah, and so yeah, I see what you mean. Is virtue then doing the right thing? I think a that is ethics is probably what that is. How it's prudence. Doing the right thing is actually prudence. Prudence is a virtue. Prudence is a virtue, and there are many such virtues. And I think the Greeks, they narrowed virtues down to what's called the four cardinal virtues. Now, the term virtue has a little bit of a religious tint to it,
Mhm.
especially Christianity. I think there's some. So Thomas Aquinas, who read a lot of Aristotle, describes all of these virtues, and there's several, and even Aristotle later on in Nicomachean Ethics describes all of these different virtues. But one could narrow those virtues down to four cardinal ones, and that's justice, temperance, courage, and wisdom. And these show up in Platonic dialogues as the four cardinal virtues. And so Aristotle carries them forward. So that is when he says honor seeking life, one is trying to exercise, like you said, the virtue muscle. So one is trying to become temperate, trying to be courageous, trying to be just, trying to achieve wisdom. And that is what a lot of the Nicomachean Ethics is about. What are these virtues? Does it mean to be courageous? What does it mean to not be courageous? What are the extremes of this? What is the middle ground of this? It's a very practical manual, if you may, practical manual. They kind of cancel each other out, but it's a manual in a way to figure out how one can become courageous, how one can become just and temperate and wise, and what are the pitfalls along the way. The Platonic dialogues introduce us to the virtue, but it never gets defined. The conversation that Socrates has around these virtues, it shows you who is a courageous person, who is a just person, and who is a wise person, but doesn't exactly define what they are. And Aristotle, being as practical a person he is, he's trying to get to a definition. He's trying to pinpoint it, and and later on, as we start conversing about this, we'll figure out how successful he got in that, uh, in pinpointing it for ourselves. But he lays a very good plan. The other thing about virtue is that virtue is a direction. It is not something that one achieves. It is a direction in which one travels. And
Mhm.
while you're on the path of virtue, you are somebody who has the potential to become virtuous, as opposed to somebody who's not on the path of virtue.
Mhm.
but it's not a destination. You can never be wise and temperate and just and courageous. Just you get there. You don't get there. You just keep walking along the path.
Right. In walking that path of virtue is also making choices in terms of potentially the difference of extremes, right? So virtue is somewhere probably in the middle of your path uh, in terms of, like an example could be like courage. You mentioned like the four cardinal virtues. So courage, right? So what are the two opposites then, the extremes of courage? Recklessness would be one.
Mm.
Um, be a coward would be cowardice, right? Would
Yes,
be on the other side of that. Is that,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that is so, so that's why it's not the middle, but it's the middle ground where courage comes in.
Mhm.
You see, this is great. As a matter of fact, yeah, you brought up a very good example. Courage is easy to define in these extremes.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing about courage that one has to realize is that a courageous person may appear reckless to some. Courageous person may appear fearful to someone. So courage is not necessarily what other folks think about you while they see you perform. It's what you believe on the inside that you are able to achieve. So having a sense of fear is is part of being courageous. You see?
Mhm.
But inaction because of fear is not courageous. You see? Action without fear is not courageous action either. A
Right.
sense of, yeah, so go ahead.
Right. Okay. Well, that's the idea of like recklessness, right?
That's the idea of reckless,
Yeah.
being brash. You
Right.
see foolhardy people,
Mhm.
you know, just having no care, if you have no care, you have no idea of the price that has to be paid, then the act is not an act that is worthy of lauding. If if you just walk into tall grass because you have never heard of a tiger,
Mhm.
right? That and turns out there was no tiger that day, right? You may appear to somebody and you're just confidently walking through it. You are blissfully unaware of the dangers. It's like you're on a raft in the Amazon and you decide to suddenly take a nice plunge in the water because the water is inviting and there are piranhas everywhere and everybody else is looking at you thinking, oh my gosh, this person is brave.
Mm.
You were just ignorant,
Right. Ignorant. Yeah.
right? But now, if you know there are piranhas in the water and someone dived into that water and you dive in after them to get them out of the water, right?
Right.
Then is an act, and you could be absolutely scared doing it. People could see the fear in your face while you dive in, but you're like, you know what? That's the right thing to do. This ignorant person dived into this water and he doesn't has no idea of the danger. I'm going to rescue this person.
Mm.
You see what I mean? There's a
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah. Good. Great example too. Yeah. So, so Aristotle in book one is talking about happiness and purpose, and then brings in the concept of virtue. And then he's bringing in this concept of, but there's also external goods that also lead to happiness,
Yeah.
or is part of what makes one happy. How do you how do you make sense of, and this is, by the way, like, so psychology terms, in in our airport bestsellers, we're talking about intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, right? I mean,
Yeah.
these money, power. I mean, these are things that don't necessarily lead to happiness, or short lived. Um, but I think Aristotle's saying that you need some level of that too in order to reach or achieve happiness. That's my interpretation.
Yeah. What do you think about it? Do you believe that to be the case?
I sat with this for a little while, and I think that to me it does come back to on a small, like in your day-to-day life, some of these things will shift your state of mind into where I am feeling pretty good, but again, it's fleeting. So I think it, I truly believe that external goods on their own will not lead to happiness. And I have plenty of examples in my life and in our world of people who are very well off and yet miserable, right? And so that is not the answer. Um, but I can see how it makes life easier to probably pursue a virtuous life and make the right decisions and be on a path of good.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And the way you said it very succinctly, it the small g goods that lead to small h happiness lead you, if one is fortunate to find themselves on this path of virtue, find themselves asking, why is it that I'm not happy despite having all of these pleasures and all of this wealth, the accolades, why, what is missing? You see, one has the difference between the happy pig and the sad Socrates is the fact that Socrates asks why,
Mm-hmm.
and is not just wallowing in, in the comforts of what's presented to him. He's a rational being, and that's what rationality is. Rationality is asking yourself what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wrong, and not just taking the conventional path and just agreeing to doing it. And it is one needs to be fortunate enough to have the ability to do it, because I do believe that there are some people who have more ability than others, but everybody has the opportunity to. But that opportunity comes by more readily for someone who has the small g goods that lead to the small h happiness. Like a simple example is, one has to be, you know, more likely to be able to participate in the common good if you're born in a certain part of the world. You have a certain, there's a certain amount of physiologic wellness that you need: sleep, food, um, things of that nature. It's like the Maslow's hierarchy,
Yeah, I was just going to go there.
right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And each of those things, like if you were to keep me awake for several days, sleep would be something that I would really desire, no matter how contemplative I am. To keep me hungry, food is something that I would desire, and I would leave contemplation in search of food. But once I have a full belly and I have rested myself at night, and I live in a society which is secure, and I don't have to worry about the safety of me or the ones I love, and I have a means to express myself at work or in some field, um, or I have that ability, then I'm in a position now to take the next step in this process.
Mm-hmm.
And once and that self-actualization bit of Maslow's hierarchy is what Aristotle is saying. It's a ladder that one has to climb, but one cannot get to the top of there are no bottom rungs of that ladder.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You need some stepping stones. Your basic needs need to be met. If you're focused on survival,
Yep.
food, shelter, and maybe there's time for contemplation, and maybe it's worth exploring, if folks who don't have basic needs met, do they spend time in contemplation around, in terms of curiosity and doing good, because they could still live a virtuous life potentially.
Aristotle is an elitist, so Aristotle will disagree.
Yes. Well, that was one of my questions for you is,
Yeah,
is Aristotle an elitist?
he is an
And you're
elitist.
saying yes.
Yes, he's
Yeah.
an elitist.
Yeah.
And he is a practical person. And again, I'm not here to disagree. Would there be examples of people who have been in absolute privation, born in it, lived in it, and been happy? I would say I can give my own example from, not my example, but I can give you my own feeling, my own thought, my gut feeling on this is that when I am stressed out, I don't find myself to be as contemplative as when I'm rested. And I believe the same is true for my fellow humans. That if I lived in a war zone, I would not. Yes, can I show courage? Can I show justice? Can I still practice those things in a war zone? Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
But I but at the same time I would be miserable. And you see, so this path to capital H happiness, one can fall off this path at any point. And yes, when you fall off this path, you find another path that gets you can come back to this path. But if you imagine someone who stays on this path the whole time just out of good fortune, and the Aristotle's argument is, and this is again, you cannot be very specific about this, right? Because this is it's a fictitious human being who's had nothing but good fortune. Along with that, they've been also have had enough experience to develop wisdom. We've had enough life experience that haven't broken them down, built them up in a way that they have come to a point where they have crossed the pleasures, crossed into honor, crossed into contemplation, and along the way carried everything along with them. They have the looks, the intelligence, the power, the money, the nature, and opportunity. And they've been able to keep their limbs about them, their wits about them, their family about them, their society, and everything is beautiful. And they've come to a place where they've been able to contribute back. Now that is almost as fictitious or as impossible a concept as Plato's capital G universal good. you know,
Yeah.
um, that's what I feel about this elitist. That's why he's blamed. That's why he's not blamed, but that's what he's called an elitist, because he believes that that human being is the closest to capital H happiness than everybody else. Now ask yourself, have you met a person like that? I mean, have you known of a person like that? I have not. Neither met, known, or even not even in books do you find people like this.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, a couple things that you mentioned that really kind of stick with me, but one is just the day to day, right? Like if I'm stressed, I'm less able to focus on a deeper concept, right? And I we can talk about our moment to moment experiences and our mindset shifts throughout the day, dozens of times a day, right? And I back in 2013 to 2015, I did research on state of mind and the impact on our day to day experience.
Huh.
And we could talk about that
Yeah.
more in a different episode, but we looked at, look, people are aware that they shift, but they always know what triggers them, but
Hmm.
they also don't always know what to do to change it into a better state of mind.
Hmm.
And I bring this up because I think that we get distracted by an awful lot of things in a coming from an elitist perspective of, well, we have resources, we have food, we have shelter. We can get bogged down with things that, there's lots of stress. What is that stress? Is that stress real? Is it something that we're creating for ourselves? Is it a distraction from, doing, the hard work, the focus work? But then it comes back again to, for me, is that virtue is something you need to exercise and practice, in that it comes and goes, and that it's not a straight linear pathway. And so that journey is ups and downs. So that was one thought. Another one is where does spirituality come into this? Because the spiritual path, not religious, but the spiritual path, is one where I don't agree with Aristotle. And again, whether we agree or not, but like I tend to agree that I think you need a certain level of external goods as part of leading to happiness, right? And those come and go, but it's still part of a bigger picture, longer term perspective. But the spiritual path is one where if you're prioritizing that, if you're someone who meditates in the morning when they get up, or prays, just prayer, however you want to define it, in the morning, once in the afternoon, in the evening, and then all of a sudden it becomes a habit, and next thing you know, it's part of your thinking throughout the day. Is that a life that can get you toward to happiness and living a virtuous life without the need for external goods?
Yeah. Yeah, I think finding specifics is going to be hard. My take on that is I can only say that from my experience, what I've seen is that when I was younger, I was pursuing things because I believed, and these aren't frivolous things. I mean, these were bigger things in life, things that are honor seeking, where my thought was when I achieved them, I would achieve happiness. And when I achieved them, I realized that that was not necessarily the case. Now, once I achieved that, then there was another goal that I wanted to achieve now. So that good that I achieved was a small g good. I just didn't realize it. It took me several iterations of doing the same thing over and over again to realize that these are small g goods. And then I asked myself, what is a capital G good? What does that mean? Like, does it even exist? And so that's what led me down this path. I had a crisis, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one needs to have the crisis because what I give this example, and I think I've heard it somewhere. I didn't come up with this, but as a child, when someone is like 4 or 5, right, and they get handed a balloon, they hold on to the balloon, and and it is the law that that balloon is the law of nature that child is going to let go of the balloon at some point, and the balloon flies away, and the child is absolutely distraught because they have lost the balloon. They don't understand the first of all, they're attached to the balloon, and as a parent or as an adult watching this, one would say, why is this child so attached to the balloon? Now you could just buy them another balloon, they get happy, but they're going to let that balloon go again. Now, um, as an adult, I understand the nature of balloons. I know balloons fly away, and I'm not attached to balloons. And I don't remember the last time. There was a time when I was attached to the big red balloon, but suddenly I lost attachment to the big red balloon. It wasn't a choice. I wasn't a 4-year-old going, you know what? It's the nature of balloons to go away. That's the nature of it. Why I should not be tied to the balloon. My capital H happiness is not tied into the balloon, and so I'm going to, no pun intended, release the balloon. I'm not going to be attached to the balloon. That didn't happen. But suddenly one day I was no longer attached to balloons. I don't care
Right.
about balloons anymore. Right? Now that says that's everybody has had that experience, but it wasn't a choice.
Right.
So you see the contemplation part of this. If I were to tell myself that I actually walked myself out of liking balloons, it's not necessarily the truth. You have to live the experience to understand the nature of these things in order to be able to give up on these things. So one has to go through pleasure, understand the nature of pleasure, give it up, Go for honor, understand the nature of honor, and give it up. And then what you would now, where you are, is this contemplative stage of your life. And now it feels like you're not tied to anything. And everybody's like, how can this person be so happy? They don't own anything. They live in privation. How can they be happy? Because one has understood the nature of, it's like a 4-year old looking at you saying, how come this person is not unhappy that they've lost their balloon?
So wisdom through experience and life
That
lessons.
is right. Yeah.
And I think that not everyone gets there.
No.
I think that so you and I both had events that triggered a shift, right?
Right.
So that red balloon for me was climbing the hierarchy and chasing money and power and next title up and having a major life event that pretty much put a stop to that immediately and led into crisis first before I came out the other end. But I made choices in my life that actually shifted. And here's what's interesting, because this is where it gets to Aristotle as potentially elitist in the talk of goods, is by making that choice and stopping the life path that I was on, I actually ended up better off externally in terms of external goods. I ended up making, having a larger salary, no longer needing a position or title. I had economic security that once I made it through the crisis, I was able to actually shift and reflect and contemplate more and to start to have these. And now this was, before the age of 40, but for a lot of, the midlife crisis, which is, I think people, I think we all experience some sort of midlife crisis, not just men, both women, men, we all do. And I think that is because we're all holding on to the red balloon.
Mm-hmm.
We're wanting a bigger red balloon, right? And
Yep.
it's like that we're chasing something, and we realize at the age between 35 and 45 that none of that means anything.
That's right.
And so back in the day, or Aristotle's time, I mean, what was the life expectancy back then, right? I mean,
40s maybe.
40s.
But yeah, but once you made it out of childhood, you could live up to your 60s and your 70s. Socrates was 74 or something when he
That's
was
right.
dead. Yeah.
Yeah.
So and he wasn't an anomaly by any means.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So I'm sure they had their own crises. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the concept of the balloon, we are all holding on to numerous big red balloons, and we keep letting some of these go, but we are still attached to some.
Mm-hmm.
And we are all identified by the balloons we hold. And those balloons are linked to our identity.
Yes.
So I had a big red balloon that I carried on for the longest time, that I was a cardiologist. And that's a big red balloon. And it's a hard balloon to let go.
Yeah.
Even now, I find it hard to let go of the balloon, even though I'm not as attached to it as I was before. I still participate in it, and I can't get away from it. And I tell myself that I'm happier for it. Yes, it genuinely brings me pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it is still a concept. It is a balloon. And there is a 60-year-old version of me, hopefully, that looks back and one day and says, I don't know when I lost it, but I don't identify myself as a physician anymore or a cardiologist anymore. I cannot choose to do it right now if I want to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, I look at that. I do a lot of work, with leaders, and this concept of letting go of ego is something that we've been bringing into teams in one-on-one coaching, because those red balloons you're speaking of are all aspects of what creates your ego.
Mm-hmm.
And to truly get contemplative and evolve, one has to let go of that. And there's lots of ways to do that. And I mean, there's even some really extreme ones with hallucinogenics and going down that path. And there's some good books out there on how you have to let go of your ego there as well.
Yeah.
But I think that the idea of the concept of letting go of ego, because it drives everything we do, and you need it. You need some of it, but it's how do you make room and space for beyond the ego?
Yeah. I would say we should move on from this, but one thing
Yeah,
I would say is that even letting go is a balloon.
right. Yeah, yeah,
You see?
yeah.
So, but we can move on from this one,
Yeah.
to underscore the point that yes, there is an elitist nature to this, but that
Mhm.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it to be it's not. We all believe that to be the case. If we were hungry, or if we were poverty stricken, expecting that one is going to have the same level of happiness and ability to contemplate and self actualize is going to be limited compared to somebody who was born into better circumstances.
Right,
We all believe that. As a matter of fact, that is what we believe as equity. We want to get everybody to a place where one is not eking out a meager living,
right.
because that is a hard way to go through life, and one cannot self actualize. And so Aristotle is as elitist as you and me.
Right, right. Totally agree. So that's a nice segue into what I believe is probably the last part that I captured from book one, which is the role of politics.
Hmm.
And that Aristotle's bringing that in. Tell me how you see politics.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah. By the way, so Aristotle, politics is a whole nother book that or
It
lecture
is
series
right,
that
right.
Aristotle delivers,
Yeah,
and it's interesting to read. A lot of how we our modern politics comes from the political science comes from Aristotelian thinking on politics. So I would start with digressing a little bit, but Plato's idea on the good was more of this universal good, and it is an individual sense of good. One needs to become a good person, capital G good. That means one has to develop a philosophical constitution inside of oneself. And that is the pinnacle of being human. Aristotle, and so before I go to Aristotle, the way, so the interlocutors of Socrates ask Socrates, is this even possible? What you're describing, this philosophical constitution, is it possible? And Socrates says, if we can imagine it, he just laid down the premise and he showed what a philosophical constitution is. Can you imagine it? And if it exists in your mind, it's a form, and one could create a copy of that. It is possible because of that reason. Now, it's a beautiful argument. One reads it, one gets convinced. But Aristotle is a critique of that argument and says, yes, all well and good, but to what benefit is it to a practical person, this form or idea of good, or this individual sense of a philosophical constitution, if one cannot express that into an action that one can see in this world? So yes, one could become this ideal person and never participate in anything external to them, and they could live this life knowing full well inside of them that they have achieved this happiness, this state of happiness. But wouldn't it be better if we, as a republic, come together and create a a republic that participates in the capital G good, just as that individual human being does? If two people achieve the capital G good, isn't that better than one? And if that, by that principle, if millions of people achieve that capital G good, isn't that better than this? Than the So that is politics for him. Is how do you get a city state to become capital G good? The the that's the reason why it's important to read the Platonic dialogues before one reads the Aristotelian lecture series, because Socrates starts his discussions by saying that trying to convince a crowd of people to do something is impossible, simply because if one is talking to a crowd and if the crowd is cheering one is telling the crowd what they want to hear.
Right.
And if one is talking to a crowd and the crowd is booing them, they're not going to change anyways. And we see that all along, right? I mean, if you look at even in the current state of politics, and when folks are giving speeches, they are surrounded by people who support them,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, is that really changing the hearts and minds of these people? No, it's not. And so, it's not an act. And so, philosophy is discussed at it's either it's on a one-on-one, like what we are doing right now, or with a or through discourse. That's what Plato and Socrates, but Socrates believed that one shouldn't be reading books even, because you shouldn't be reading a book and having a discussion with oneself. One should be discoursing on politics, a very small group of people. But the aim is to improve oneself. Aristotle doesn't believe that. Aristotle believes that one can actually create a lecture series and go out and talk to princes and expect them to now become these philosopher rulers who then build city states. Well, we know how all that turned out. Like, his pupil was Alexander the Great.
Right.
What do you think about politics?
Yeah. What do I think? I think that in theory, I love the idea of it, and I think that it's almost a little utopian.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's the right if I'm using it correctly, but that's what comes to mind when I think of, well, if we all live this way and we get the big capital G and we're all in it together,
Right.
And that's just I think it's nice if it's a great in concept that that's what politics should be, is to political science should be like the you're in it for the greater good,
Mm-hmm.
to help others, bring others up, right, raise others together. And I am a firm believer in leaders teaching leaders, right? And people, right? So at the end of the day, a leader, but it's not through necessarily debate or standing up there. It can be shown in action instead of just words, right? It's both. Um, but we look at a lot of I work in a lot of organizations and see a lot of different cultures, and culture starts at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to prop everyone up, and I'm working right now with an organization that has an incredible culture, and every member of the senior team lives and breathes that culture, and they speak of it and they act that way, and they are growing very quickly, and they refuse to bring in people who are potentially not a good culture fit.
Mm.
So that's not to say that there's no conflict, right? I mean, there is conflict, and there's decision making
Yeah.
challenges, and there's growth challenges. But the idea of politics and focusing on the capital G for everyone, conceptually, I think is a wonderful idea. I think that I don't know if it was like that back then in Aristotle's time. I don't know if it's like that now. I don't know if power and all these big red balloons get in the way of other people, of focusing on the greater good for others, I think.
Yeah.
Yet if we're all focused on living a virtuous life, that shouldn't be the case.
It shouldn't be the case. That's correct.
Yeah.
See, the thing is, what comes in is the opinions. Opinions is what is the problem here. Because even in the example that you gave, the company that has in its leadership people who believe in culture, but you said something right after that they would not include people in there who don't believe in that culture.
Right.
Right. And
Right.
so if one is, so that then becomes a very it takes away from the capital G good is the common good. That
Mhm.
means universal good. Now, universal good could be all humans, but you could be for the planet. Now, once you can create little microcosm, right? Your one's Atlantis, where everything is beautiful and great, and then outside of it is all terrible, and so then one can ask yourself, have you then created? Then one could say, even if you add one more person to that,
Mhm.
right? Wouldn't that increase the good? Then yes, so that means you have not achieved capital G good,
Right.
you know, because if anything more can be added to it to make it better, you haven't achieved capital G good. Um, and so the thing that we one of the things that I think we should have hit upon and we didn't necessarily is that when Aristotle says happiness, it is not the same happiness that we think about in there's no word really for it, and I think the word that we have come up with, or what the word that is flourishing comes as close to happiness in the sense of how Aristotle describes it. Eudaimonia is the term that he's talking about.
Right.
And you had alluded to this, eudaimonia, or happiness, that capital H happiness, eudaimonia, flourishing. To flourish requires one to have all of the small g goods and the small h happinesses all leading up to the contemplative, the ability to then extend that beyond oneself into the one's community, into one's country, into one's, and beyond. That ability is flourishing. One can do that. Now, as you could imagine, one could be on this path and then suddenly deviate off of this path at any point. And the road to hell is paved with good intentions is what they
Right.
say. I keep saying that, but I'll tell you, this is a great example of how one has to be very careful if one is trying to build a city state and go down this Aristotelian path. Obviously, Alexander is the Great is one. Muammar Gaddafi was a Platonist. Okay,
Yeah, I
and
did not know that.
yeah,
Yeah.
and he was somebody who read Plato and Aristotle and believed himself to be the philosopher king. And we all know what happened.
Right.
You know, now Muammar Gaddafi, for the longest time, one could have said, in his own weird, peculiar way, had achieved the pinnacle of what Aristotle was talking about, trying to build a state and trying to involve himself in the politics outside of his state, but died a very terrible death, a terrible death. I mean, it's and so at some point, see, if he'd have died 20 years before he actually died, he probably would be somebody that, in his mind would have been someone who was flourishing.
Right.
But up to the moment of his death, even the manner of his death was so painful that it just goes to show what Aristotle says, that it is it is a eudaimonia of flourishing is something that is retrospective. You look back at your life and say, have I achieved it? And you could be one step away from having the most painful experience and then completely forgetting everything that happened behind you. And that is how ephemeral this concept of flourishing or eudaimonia is. You see, and a lot of people who do many very evil things believe they're doing it in the path of some common good. They're just ignorant of the fact that what they're doing is not, in fact, aligned with the common good. They just forget it somewhere along the way. The whole German war machine is an example of that.
Right. Right.
And so there are several such examples. And you could suddenly find yourself and, shooting yourself in a bunker somewhere. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
as a matter of fact, Mussolini and Gaddafi have similar in common, something in common, right? Like Mussolini was terribly tortured and killed, towards the end. And but you could imagine up to a certain point, Mussolini actually thought that he was in fact some sort of a, a philosopher king. I don't know Mussolini's philosophical underpinnings. I don't know, but I could tell you that he probably felt he was flourishing till he was not. And then
Right.
if right before he was tortured and hung, if you were to ask him, do you think you led a good life? What do you think he would say? He was absolutely in pain. And
Yeah.
so one could step off, and that's looking back. And I think that's an important concept to have. And so then that's another reason why I believe that um it is not a destination. Flourishing or eudaimonia is not a destination, it's a direction. And if one is not aligned in the path of virtue, one is not in the direction of eudaimonia. It may look like you're flourishing in life.
Right.
You have all the trappings of it.
Right.
You have all the small g goods, but you are way off.
Yes. I think you captured it very well, very, very nicely. I think that's in your lifetime, you never actually reach the capital G good. It's a path. It's I'm going to say it even though I hate it, but it's a lifestyle choice in terms of how you choose to go through the world in the life that you're living. Um, yeah. And so at the end, that's when you can reflect and say, I had a good life or I didn't, or, and there, if you're looking at the big picture, you might say yes, but then, again, like in a moment's time, all of a sudden, you had good intentions for a while, and then, all of a sudden, you know, you're on a different path, and all those good intentions are gone and forgotten.
Absolutely. And see, that's why being on the path of virtue is more important than trying to be on the path of eudaimonia.
Yeah,
If you get too caught up in trying to get all the small h's and the small g's,
right.
and forget that all you needed to do was walk along the path of justice, temperance, courage, and then eventually wisdom, that is better. And to your point, can the contemplative man be happy? Yes. Even if you may have given up all of these small g's and small h's along the way, one would not find themselves being tortured and hung, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
Um, and so I would say that is a better life than a life of luxury that then eventually leads to something terrible at the end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, this is great.
Yeah, I think so. I think we covered book one now, right? Is
Yeah,
that, yeah.
thoroughly done. He does describe these virtues now. He talks about between the two virtues, the justice, temperance, courage, and wisdom. There are intellectual virtues and then more practical virtues. And then I think book two, he kind of talks a little bit about, those intellectual virtues and stuff. So we start now, we actually get into the meat and bones of his, now that he's laid this prelude about these virtues and how one becomes a virtuous person. How does one exercise the virtuous muscle, as you had said?
Yeah, yeah, exciting.
Yeah,
All right. So book two
looking
is
forward to that.
next.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you.